And this week we're looking at photographs and how to think of them in terms of how we want the painting to look as opposed to making the painting look like a photograph. And it's a real conscious decision. When I pick something, I'm really thinking of what I have to change in the photograph to make it work better, so that when I start, I know right away what I'm going to do. And generally, it's after doing 2 or 3 thumbnails. Sometimes, if it's more complicated, I do little 5x7, even 3x5 little value studies where I'm just using 3 values, sometimes just 2 values, just black and white paint, just to find that shadow pattern, work out big shapes of dark and light. But then also, I want to think through the idea of color. And a lot of times I'll make color notes on my thumbnail or just at a piece of paper next to the painting where I know I want to change things. And a lot of times I'll do that right off the bat as I'm drawing my landscape on the canvas. I'll put a spot of color where I know I want to change it. For instance, the greens back there, they're a little cooler, but they don't really go back very far. So when I paint that, I want to make a note that I want this to be really bluish. Even some blue-violet, not even blue-green, maybe some blue-green from here to here. But back here, I want blue, blue-violet. I want to really shove that back. And the photograph's not going to give us that. We have to be aware of how to create depth with cooler colors, lighter values, and more muted intensity in the color. Then I also want to force more shadow pattern in here. Now the first thing I do when I look at this is decide what's important. And I really like this area. Obviously that's kind of the focal point. But I also like some of this stuff too. So what I could do, of course I can do a really long composition, and that actually is kind of nice, but it's too long. So I'm going to zoom in, and kind of zoomed in here, I have the barns over here that I like. I like the trees, kind of the backlit barns and trees here. And this is still a bit too long. So what I'm going to do is, I want to force a lot of this stuff, all the vertical trees, even if they're real light, or they look very light, they're all going to be a dark. Then the slanted planes of the hills back in here and the flat plains are going to be a lot lighter. So that's my main contrast, is that separation of vertical from the slanted and the flat by a pretty strong value contrast. And I have to force everything into one of those 3 planes and force it into either a simple dark or a simple light. I don't want as much halftone as there is here. This is in Sheridan, Wyoming, and it's getting close to noontime, so the light's getting a little flat. So the trees are getting lighter, the flat ground's getting lighter, but I want to push it more. So also compositionally, and you'll see this, I can't do this on the photograph, but when I paint, I will have squeezed this side and this side together. I'm going to eliminate some of this stuff so that they push together just a little bit. My canvas size is an 8x12. So again, I like this area and that, but I can get rid of some of that so I can move them together. I'm also going to move in a little bit here too. So then after setting up the composition, I want to go ahead and find the shadow pattern, which will look something like this. And I just made all the shadows 1 value and forced everything in that. All trees, well, I left some lights obviously on the tops because the sun's coming straight down. But all trees are a dark shrubbery, big small trees, even should have some dark bluish values up in here for the trees back in there. And that really separates, it really creates more contrast, makes the painting look more 3-dimensional. Here it's not, because all these values in here tend to run together too much. So when I force everything either into light or dark, it sets up that pattern of dark and reads a lot better. So the vertical stuff separates from the slanted and the flat. Then I went ahead and pushed everything, from about here back, I made it a lot bluer. Some bluish green here, but then really blue back in here, kind of a muted blue. Then as things come forward, they gradually get warmer. I'm adding more yellow till I get up here, and there's a lot of yellow in these greens and oranges. So forcing things, cooler as they recede, warmer as they come forward, all the shadows in a dark pattern. Now, when I start painting, obviously, this shadow is going to be a little lighter than this shadow, and there's going to be some more lights in here, but I want this dark pattern to remain. Even at the end of the painting, I want that dark pattern to be kind of evident. It won't be this evident, because I'll be adding different values of shadow. But I want to see it this way first. If I can see it this big and simple, it's going to be a lot easier to paint. But if I'm seeing it like this and not thinking of those changes, to make the verticals dark, bigger, simpler, and cooler as things recede and warmer as they come forward, you're going to get caught up in the detail, and your values are going to be way off because you'll be doing too many small dark and light shapes. There's way too many little variations of dark and light all through here, and I want to pull them together. Everything upright is dark, everything flat or slanted is going to be lighter. Now I might come back and get a few more lights on the upright, but just on the tops or maybe the side. I want the majority of that upright to be a dark. You can see it more in this tree. This has more dark, a little bit of light on top, but some of them, it gets kind of lost. It turns halftone. The darks are not very dark. But again, I'm separating planes here. Same thing with the horses. The only reason they stand out at all is because they're upright and they're dark against the flat plane of the grass. So separate those planes more. Find that shadow pattern, which means looking at the photograph differently than what you think. Now this is similar to the last one, even though the light's a little lower, it's later in the afternoon, it's still hard to find that shadow pattern. But I want to find it first. And again, the thumbnail helps us do that. That's why when I do a thumbnail, then I draw on the canvas, I want to use the thumbnail as my drawing guide, because that's where I've simplified things and made all the changes. But I want to really pull this together so that all that is the shadow pattern. You can see I forced a lot of what looked like light into the shadow pattern to make the tree look more three-dimensional, more definite, solid light pattern. You can see there's a lot of little lights and darks in there, but I just want to pull it together. This is the effect of the sunlight creating these shadows. And the more I can simplify them, pull them together, the easier that is to paint. Now I know everything in the shadow is going to be cooler than everything in the light area. It creates more of the sense of shadow and sunlight. We have a painting here by Marion Wachtel. Her husband was Elmer Wachtel. You can look at her painting here, and I don't know whether she painted it out. She probably did paint it outside or did it from some drawings. But you can see how simplified everything is. Even though there's a lot of color variations in these darker trees, they're a solid mass. Few sky holes. Same thing with the foreground. There's a simple dark and light. Background, very blue. Probably you could see a lot more yellows and greens in there. But she simplified it, just made it blue to make it recede. Otherwise, it's not going to go back as far as it does. If you paint things just the way you see them, you're not going to get that depth. And you usually won't get that separation of warm and cool contrast either. So know what you're trying to achieve, value contrast, temperature contrast, simplifying the dark pattern, simplifying the lights, and keep it that way throughout the whole painting. Even though you're starting to break it up more, keeping it bigger, simpler, more solid will help it work better.